Okay, are we all well? I hope so. Thank you very much for joining, and I hope you enjoy the talk. What I would ask at this point is if you do have any questions, I'm more than happy to take them at the end, but I'd rather leave it at the end if that's all right with you. So, the first and second coming. I think it'll be clarified a little if any of you are not au fait with the basic history of the nursing personnel in the Army Medical Services. I've been asked to provide this talk, as you will be aware, I'm sure, to mark the 30th anniversary of the Army male nurses being transferred from the Royal Army Medical Corps into Queen Alexandra's Royal Army Nursing Corps. Now, male nurses, they've served in or with military forces around the world throughout the history of human conflict. The Roman army included soldiers known as milites medici, who were exempt from all other duties. Some formed the staff of the Legion hospitals, and as such are shown on Rome's Trajan column. And I've got a slide there for you.
People can see.
Can you all see that?
Yep, that's all clear.
I can see it.
Right. Right, can we move on? I must say, I've got my daughter here, who's the registrar at Cranfield University, helping me out because I'm a bit of a duffer as far as these things are concerned.
Yeah,
In the 14th century, the Brothers Hospitaller of St. John of God provided care for people, both physically and psychologically impaired, and challenged the stigmas which were associated with mental illness. And they continue to care for patients to this day. I want to concentrate on defining the story of Army male nurses during the groundbreaking developments of the 19th and 20th centuries, which led to the situation that exists today. I'm a very strong believer in the phrase, if we don't know where we've come from, we won't know where we're going. In 1973, during a disastrous military debacle in Flanders, a military hospital, known then as the York Hospital, was opened in Chelsea. This was followed in 1819 by a Napoleonic structure in Chatham, Fort Pitt, which took over from York Hospital and became the Army's principal military hospital and first medical training establishment with a staff which included untrained male orderlies in the soldiers' wards. Now, these were soldiers which had been drawn from the local garrison. The regiments that were serving there probably sent some of those they were glad to get rid of. There were also female nurses there who cared for the soldiers' families, which were admitted to a wing of that hospital. In 1823, a separate hospital for military officers and soldiers suffering from psychiatric disorders was established at Folkestone. That was later moved to Great Yarmouth, where male soldiers were again employed in caring for the patients. And that establishment remained open until Netley came along, but that's going ahead of ourselves a little bit. Whilst female nurses who were normally soldiers' wives had been employed in regimental hospitals throughout the 18th century in the Napoleonic Wars. From 1827, the War Department issued regulations which forbade the employment of female nurses without the prior approval of the Secretary at War. Now, why was this? I've asked that question several times, and all I can think of is that after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, much as we've experienced over the last 50 years, it was probably a measure aimed at a post-war move to protect regimental establishments, soldiers on the ground, rather than putting female nurses into the regimental hospitals. As a result, therefore, nursing care provided at Fort Pitt and the regimental hospitals was undertaken by these untrained medical soldiers who were, it has to be admitted, reluctantly seconded from nearby regiments and were liable to be frequently returned to their units at a moment's notice. The Crimean War and the subsequent Royal Commission made it clear that a higher level of military nursing expertise was required. So on the 19th of May, 1863, the first patients were admitted to the newly constructed Royal Victoria Hospital at Netley on Southampton Water. This was the first purpose-built military hospital. Miss Jane Stewart had been appointed the superintendent of female nurses, and 6 nursing sisters were transferred there from St Thomas's Hospital in London. And you'll see this link between St Thomas's Hospital and Army nursing running through as a vein until certainly the 1920s. These 6 nurses were there to supervise the work of the male orderlies, and by this time we find ourselves with the recently formed Army Hospital Corps. So at least there were now soldiers who were receiving some training. I mentioned earlier the Hospital for Lunatic Patients, which was in Great Yarmouth. That closed, and the inpatients and staff were transferred to Netley. As a result of inadequacies and failures in hospital care, especially the lack of a mechanism for increasing nursing establishments in times of war, which had been identified during the South African Wars of the late 19th century, Queen Alexandra's Imperial Nursing Service was established in 1902. And this was a result of the personal initiative of the Queen. It was to be a civilian organization attached to the military, albeit the sisters were granted officer status. The newly organized and recruited trained nurses from a select group of London training hospitals, particularly St Thomas's, showed the direct influence of Florence Nightingale, which of course hung over all nursing at the time. From the outset, it was envisaged as a female-orientated organization. Since its formation in 1898, the recently formed RAMC had been planning a comprehensive program of nurse training for soldiers drawn from within its ranks. The exact date for the commencement of this program of training for male nurses is unclear, but surviving regulations do show that it was certainly underway by 1907. Successful candidates, on completion of the course and 3 years of ward-based experience, were awarded a first-class trade certificate, which was known as the AFC 344. Now, I'm quite sure that there are some who remember this, but it hung on until certainly the late 60s. Army nursing and nurse training was supervised by a nursing board chaired by the Queen, and composed of the matrons of 3 London hospitals, including St Thomas's again. The Army's 3-year training programme for these soldiers was therefore based on that of the large nurse training schools in London, with examinations at the end of each year of training. After 3 years, the candidates sat a final examination consisting of both theoretical papers lasting 10 hours in all, with practical tests being held on another day. And I've got a little slide here which will show what that training consisted of. So there were at least 3 questions set in each subject. The overall pass mark was 50% in all papers in a similar format and a general syllabus which remained familiar to all of us who were student nurses who undertook nurse training prior to Project 2000. What is less frequently known is that the founding charter for the QARNC included a statement whereby suitably qualified soldier nurses of the RAMC could be admitted to the newly formed service. So what did this phrase suitably qualified mean for the RAMC nurses who wanted admission to QARNC? Well, unfortunately, successful acceptance into the QARNC left the RAMC male nurses situation completely ambiguous, not least because they remained soldiers of the RAMC. They were entitled to wear the Cape badge of the QARNC, but in bronze rather than silver, the same as was worn by female staff nurses, you may remember, during the First World War, worn on the right side of their uniform. I think we've got the wrong slide there.
That's the next one. Do you want me to go through?
Yeah, there we are. They also received 6 months a day over and above their normal pay, but they could only remain as such until they were promoted to the rank of sergeant, at which time they surrendered their pay increment, their identifying QARNC badge, and membership of the service. As a privilege, those with long meritorious service were frequently permitted to retain the badge as a mark of honor. That was all. There the situation remained until 1919, when the General Nursing Council Register was established. That year, the first GNC male register, known as the Supplementary Register, separate from the female register, contained the names of 15 men, with a further 9 added before the end of 1922. Nearly 10,000 female general nurses had registered at the same time. So why am I talking about a civilian organization? Well, the first male nurse who was registered as a state registered nurse was a certain George Dunn of Liverpool. Now he, like 12 other men on the first page of the register, had trained in the RAMC. 2 had been trained in hospitals in India and 1 in Malta. 11 of the first tranche of nurses had military experience in World War I, and at least 1, Harold Whitcomb, who was SRN number 22, had also served in the Boer War. 3 were also on the psychiatric part of the register, including George Essex, SRN, who was number 21. Now, he later became chief male nurse at Harrison Hospital in Dorset, and Edward Bryant, SRN number 10, had a full career in the RAMC, serving in Egypt, France, and on hospital ships during World War I, and rose to be an acting warrant officer. One of the youngest men on the register was Frederick Stratton, SRN number 6, who'd started training in 1914, but Having been drafted into the army, he didn't qualify until 1920. Other things had taken his attention. 3 years later, 3 years after qualifying, he was elected unopposed to the General Nursing Council and represented male nurses on the supplementary register until 1932. 10 years. Soldiers who completed their army examination became eligible to apply to the registrar of the General Nursing Council for admission to the SRN examinations without further training. But first they had to seek further recommendations in order to sit the state registry examination, with the current army regulations requiring the following.
Is that the previous slide?
Yeah. So I'll leave you just to have a look at that. I think one of the main hurdles was getting certified by matron. Right, we'll pass on. In practical terms, this frequently resulted in an army-trained nurse sitting the GNC prelim examination at one sitting and the state final at the next. At last, this meant, though, that military male nurses could achieve the same qualifications as their civilian counterparts who, I surmise, they considerably outnumbered at that time. Throughout the interwar years, male nurses continued to perform their professional duties around the world, with nurse training being conducted in a variety of military hospitals at home and overseas. By the beginning of World War II, there were 528 men registered, of whom roughly 50% were from the armed forces. Approved training schools had increased to about 10 by 1940, but rose to 90 by 1947. Nevertheless, the number of men registered remained low. Representatives of male nurses argued for the amalgamation of both parts of the General Register in 1943, and that drew criticism from their female counterparts. Before long, however, the 1949 Nurses Act abolished the supplementary register anyway, and male nurses joined the General Register alongside their female colleagues. In 1947, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the QARANC, as we all know, was converted from its status as an attached civilian organization to an integral corps of the army, renamed Queen Alexandra's Royal Army Nursing Corps. The new corps was classed as an all-female corps with its own service identity and military rank structure. And henceforth, qualified female nurses were appointed to commissioned officer status, whilst the all-female format of the corps precluded the admission of male members of another corps. Nevertheless, entitled serving soldiers were permitted to continue wearing their old QARMNS badge until their last representative, Major E.H.P. Hills, shown here, finally retired as late as 1968. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, during the days of national service and beyond, male nurses had to suffer the inequality of service as private soldiers and, of course, non-commissioned officers, some with many years of service, whilst their female colleagues were granted officer status on entry with all that came to represent, such as prestige, status, pay, and enhanced pension rights. Frequently, men with considerable experience and length of service found themselves subordinated to recently qualified female nursing officers to whom they were, in fact, professionally superior. For many, the only avenue to the commissioned rank lay in leaving nursing duties to take on military administrative roles. As the years passed, the inappropriate situation became increasingly recognized, and gradually, professional worth took precedence. By 1969, the morale and self-image of the military male nurse had taken a battering. Now, I'd like to quote from an anonymous article published in the Army Medical Services magazine in the April of that year, and I'll leave it to you to judge why it was anonymous. I quote, "There is a place and a need for the nurses of both corps. The QARANC nurse has, of course, always been given her due recognition, but can the same be said about the RAMC nurse? The confidence given to a patient by the skill and by the firm yet gentle strength of the average trained male nurse is something that needs to be experienced to be fully appreciated. When sick or injured, the average British soldier loves to be nursed by the QARANC. What serviceman wouldn't? There are, however, many nursing procedures that the soldier patient finds more acceptable as coming from man to man. It's in this and similar circumstances the RAMC nurse of today brings the knowledge and experience of the specialist to his work. The psychology of his approach towards his patients, with its admixture of good sense and sympathy, demonstrates that he is in fact a specialist in a way which sets him in a positive position in the whole nursing profession. It's in this context that we might again ask whether today's RAMC male nurse is receiving all due recognition for his work. So this bizarre situation happened to coincide with poor recruitment of medical officers and the disruption to their professional training as a result of the demands for medical officers to accompany teeth arm units embarking on roulement tours in Northern Ireland. This, I will submit, acted as a catalyst for the events which followed. Extended deliberations took place within the Ministry of Defence, which eventually resulted in the reallocation of some 70 officers' vacancies from the QARANC establishments to that of the RAMC. Several male nurses had previously been granted commissions within the administrative or quartermaster cadres, but not specifically as nursing officers. Originally, a male to female ratio for commissions was set at 80% female, 20% male. This discriminatory situation was subsequently eliminated, and the ratio at time of writing had improved to approximately 35% male, 65% female. Those figures may well have been surpassed by now. I don't have access to the current ones. Equivalent figures for the NHS were not to hand, but the Army's situation compared reasonably well within the civilian picture. In the spring of 1974, a signal was sent out to all AMS units announcing that these vacancies would be allocated initially to suitably serving male SRNs on the basis of 15 per year until the vacancies were fulfilled. Almost immediately, a second signal was initiated, calling for applications from suitably qualified male RAMC state-registered nurses to apply for consideration. And in early June of that year, things moved really quite quickly because a board was held at the RAMC College at Millbank, and subsequently on the 28th of June, the first 15 successful candidates, amongst whom I was fortunate to be included, were commissioned into the Royal Army Medical Corps as nursing officers for employment specifically on nursing duties. Immediately following their commissioning, the new officers attended a 6-week junior officers course at Keogh Barracks in the summer of that year, and on completion were posted to various military hospitals. In later weeks, various of these new officers were required to attend a course known then as the Regimental Medical Officer's Assistant, or RMOA course. This was intended to prepare them for duties accompanying regiments proceeding on roulement tours in Northern Ireland. However, by the time the first of these courses were held, many of the new officers, including myself, had already undertaken a Northern Ireland tour with infantry battalions. fairly standard, I would think. In 1975, a further 15 male nursing officers were commissioned, amongst whom was Captain John Hubbard, who some of you may remember. He, at his commissioning board, when asked where he saw his career progressing, said his ambition was to become the first pipe-smoking matron. He was actually commissioned, and later became the first commissioned male nursing officer to qualify for work in operating theatre nursing. Sadly, John's pipe led to a tragic outcome when he succumbed to lung cancer in 1983, with male nursing officers acting as pallbearers at his funeral. Over successive years, increasing numbers of Army-trained male nurses were commissioned to fulfill service requirements, serving in both hospital duties and on active service. This was particularly the case in Northern Ireland, where initially they were paired with a doctor serving in another regiment in a neighbouring location. The RMOA, later renamed Regimental Nursing Officer, or RNO, provided on-site emergency and first aid cover, advice, continuity of care, and a referral service in the role of a nurse practitioner with direct access to the military hospital service. This concept proved a great success some years in advance of similar nursing appointments, nurse practitioners within the NHS. Later, the role was extended further to include similar duties on extended military exercises abroad in isolated situations. Indeed, nurses were undertaking such duties during the Falklands campaign, the First Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, and many other operations. Despite their continued membership of the RAMC, male nurses had evolved and were by this time in direct career competition with their female colleagues, and also in line for promotions and job opportunities. This was evidenced by, from 1980 onwards, promotion to field rank, and from 1982, male nurses were employed in nursing administrative roles. From the early 1980s, alongside corps-wide changes, the commissioning of direct entry male applicants from civilian life was introduced, as well as the availability in the Reserve Army. Following the end of the Cold War, the subsequent defence cuts and rationalisation of military assets, it was finally recognised that the situation whereby there was duplication of effort and cost in having identical trades, if I can call it that, spread between various military bodies. Out of this restructuring in 1992, the momentous decision was taken to transfer non-nursing officers and clerical staff from the QARANC to the RAMC, or vice versa, whilst in a reciprocal move, male nurses were rebadged RAMC into the QARNC, the finally secured identical terms of service for men and women. After so many years, the QARNC was a fully integrated nursing corps, and since that time, appointments within the military nursing world have been made purely on the basis of best person for the job. Members of the QARNC serve wherever the Army needs medical support for its troops, often in isolated positions requiring considerable personal commitment, as well as responsibility and the ability to act on individual initiative. Members of the Corps have served with the United Nations forces in Bosnia and Croatia, Angola, Rwanda, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, East Timor, Iraq, Afghanistan, and several other locations around the world. Others have served alongside members of the SAS, trained as helicopter pilots, and provided medical cover to expeditions to such places as Peru and the crossing of the Gobi Desert. Senior male nursing officers undertake appointments in both clinical and administrative nursing posts, with the opportunity for senior career advancement courses. Male and female nurses are now in direct competition with other military colleagues for appointment to senior command posts. Male nursing in the Army has advanced a long, long way. Recruits for nurse training, both male and female, enter the army as private soldiers and after normal military training, enter upon the relevant university course. On completion of their registration and having gained 2 years post-registration experience, they may apply for a commission as nursing officers in competition with suitably qualified and experienced applicants from the NHS. In 2019, UCAS, the body that arranges university courses, announced a record-breaking number of male school leavers had applied to be nurses following NHS England's successful We Are the NHS recruitment campaign. The number of 18-year-old men applying to study nursing had increased by more than 50% in a decade. According to new figures from UCAS, that is an amazing situation. From the previous year, there'd been a 9% jump in men applying to study nursing, a career that is often wrongly being portrayed as solely a female profession. Thankfully, as a result of the changes outlined above, the situation of the male nurse in the army of today is startlingly better than experienced in former years. So, thank you very much for your attention. I hope that's given you some thoughts to ponder. And if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to attempt to answer.